One. Hello and welcome to This Day, a history podcast from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. And here we are with our Some Sunday Context series, our series of Sunday shows in which we try and get a little context for what is playing out in the first year of the second Trump administration. We're doing little essays and pulling stuff out of the archives, and at least a couple times a month, we're getting together and chatting about what is in the news, and then trying to focus in on one particular issue and historical context. We are doing this on video, too, so shout out to everyone who's been watching this on our YouTube page, which is growing at a nice clip, and I would encourage people to go check that out and subscribe there, because we're posting, obviously, these longer conversations, but also posting lots of clips and so forth, trying to do more video. So here we are. On a Sunday, good morning to Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Good morning, Jody. Hey there.
Happy weekend. You want to do a little catching up? How's your week? And non-political edition.
Well, we sort of have our false spring underway here, and that means that I have all of these daffodils that are blooming in front of my house, and it makes me so happy. Yeah. I know. We get it here first in the Upper South, so we're sending it up your way.
It's coming, Kellie, to the Northeast. I rode a bike over a bridge for the first time this week, and I was like, "There's no turning back."
Right, that's right. Like even when it gets back down below freezing, you just treat it like it's spring. You make it be spring.
I broke the seal.
That's real. I definitely wore a lighter jacket the other day, and I was like, "It's coming, it's coming." Like I was getting a little excited, but we still have snow. We still have a lot of snow on the ground that just hasn't melted yet, and so until that's gone, I think I'll feel a little better. But I do think it's kind of funny that because we live on top of a hill, and our kids like to sled down to the bus stop, and so JoJo got on her sled, and there's a massive puddle at the bottom of the driveway because all the snow is melting, and she hit the hill and then hit a bump and then flew into the air and landed splash into the puddle.
This is like before she goes to school.
This is right before. And we're like, JoJo, do you need new pants? Are you soaking wet? She was like, I'm good.
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Well, I'll tell you, I mean, that's a very cute story. I will attest to the fact that Kellie's kids are almost unbearably cute, because the highlight of my last couple of weeks, one of them was certainly seeing Kellie and her family in New York when you did an event with Wade Thompson at the New York Historical Society. And we posted a photo of that in the newsletter. People can go check it out, but it was really great to see.
Yeah.
Right. Obviously, an incredible pairing. And then your family was there too. So that was great.
That was fun. Good times.
Yeah. But yeah, it's really
so now let's pivot.
Well, look, let me say two things that are not full pivot. One is I'll offer a thing that I'm excited about that is not related to the state of the world, which is I just launched a new show that I've been wanting to do a music show for a long time. Music is probably like the thing that has mattered the most to me in my life. I have never done a music podcast, and so I just launched a music podcast. I may post some of it in the feed down the line once we have a few episodes out there, but I'll write about it more in the newsletter, and if people want to go check it out. But it's called Summer Album, Winter Album. It's co-hosted with this guy, Craig Finn, who's the lead singer of a band called The Hold Steady, who I really love. And we just talk about albums we love. And it's just been really nice to say, oh, what do I have to do today? Oh, I have to listen to like a Joni Mitchell album 4 times to prep for this.
Oh, my gosh.
Like it's really, it's been a nice escape. So I would encourage people to check out the new show, but also listen to music, folks. Listen, just go listen to albums. My God.
Yes. Can I just say that's something my husband has been doing, where we would get up in the morning. The first thing we do is like turn on the news, turn on a podcast, turn on something. And he's like, we have a new rule. And I was like, what's that? He was like, we have to listen to 3 songs before we start our day. And so we were playing Stevie Wonder's I Love Every Little Thing About You. And I was like, yes. And it just got me in a vibe that I was like, this is how we should be doing our day.
Yeah, I love that tip. Then the other kind of news worth sharing is, and I'm going to do a screen share here, but a few eagle-eyed listeners have noticed.
Your background just changed.
Yeah.
My background just changed?
Yeah.
Do you see this?
I see it.
We'll see this. I don't know if it's going
to This day.
Okay, so yes, listeners, look right here. The show, we changed the name of the show. So we've been talking about this internally for a little bit. I can explain the sort of rationale, but yeah, the show is now just This Day. The artwork just says This Day, a history show. Do either of you have reactions?
Well, first, if you have this day in esoteric political history swag, it is now collector item.
Right, yeah.
So
Vintage.
think about that. And then also you'll probably need to re-up your swag. So we'll have to put some new things in the merch store.
I love a nickname. Do you know what I mean? I love like all my kids kind of have long names and I like shortening it. So like the idea of this day feels just like a nickname for a much longer podcast. So I'm for it.
So look, here's some of the thinking, which I'm happy to share, and I'll write about this more in the newsletter as well. Well, first, I recognize there's a little bit of who moved my cheese whenever you do something like this, and people like get in there. And I already got a couple emails from people being like, "What's the deal? Is this a different show?" First off, I have found both for myself and us and almost everyone I talk to that like people are calling the show This Day anyway. I like the original title. I came up with it, but frankly, I've gotten to the point where just saying This Day in esoteric political history is just like a little work. And it's just kind of like
a lot of work.
I just find myself like spitting it out and not being. And so This Day just feels cleaner. Listeners, you have permission to keep calling it This Day in esoteric political history to yourself or to others or whatever. I will say, like, as you recommend the show, you can just say This Day. We have the top SEO slot when you type This Day. So people will find the show. There is a sort of larger thinking behind it, which we'll talk about a little more as the year goes on. But part of it is that I think as we enter year 5 of this show, we're trying to sort of broaden the aperture a little bit and be able to talk about not just esoteric stories and not just political stories, but kind of use 5 years worth of looking at American history to really learn some big lessons and talk about some big themes. And obviously the Sunday shows, I think that's a lot of what we're going to be doing there. We're still going to be doing a lot of small, weird, funny, unknown stories throughout. But there's a little bit of that. And then the other one is looking ahead even more to 2026. We actually have a big plan for 2026, which is the sesquicentennial. So get used to saying that word. But that is the 250th birthday of the United States. And we're planning a big year-long series that is not going to completely pivot the format of the show, but change it a little bit into kind of more multi-part. We're actually thinking of going week by week throughout the year and talking about kind of like the moments that made this country over the course of 250 years. So a little bit of the changing of the name is to then set us up to then pivot for this big, ambitious series that we're trying to do all of next year.
Our farewell to America.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe.
Don't say that.
Well, look, part of it is, we've talked about this on the show, but the bicentennial, 25 years ago in 1976.
50 years ago.
50 years ago, sorry, math. The bicentennial 50 years ago was an incredibly contentious moment in this country, right? Post-Watergate, just after the Vietnam War. And those kind of stories that America told about itself in that year, with the bicentennial kind of prompting it, really cemented a lot of, I think, core ideas about how this country sees itself. And that, we've talked about this a little bit, but that's when I think a lot of the kind of lost cause mythology got cemented and a lot of these. And so we're in another really fractured moment. And I think next year is going to be one of those years where it's like, what are the stories that this country tells itself about its history and how it got to this moment? And I think we want to be part of that. And so we have a big, ambitious plan. We're going out there now to try and find some support and some funding for that. And I'm going to write about this more a little bit in the newsletter as we go. But if anyone listening has a hookup to a foundation or a philanthropist or someone who wants to sort of support ambitious historical work next year for the sesquicentennial, now's the time that we're starting to kind of get our ducks in a row for that. Anyway, that was very long-winded, and you'll hear lots more about this, listeners. But the point is, the show, you can just call it This Day from now on, and that's what I'll continue to do.
And you can use all of that spare time over the next 10 months to figure out how to say sesquicentennial.
Right.
3 times fast.
Can't even do it once slowly. So.
Right, exactly. We simplified the name just to set ourselves up to say an even more complicated word.
That's right.
I love that. All right. So the way we do these Sunday episodes is we'll start a little bit by asking a question we ask each time we gather on Sundays, which is, what year are you thinking of? And a chance to sort of talk about a moment. And then we're going to focus in with a little bit of historical context on one particular issue that's bubbling right now. And today we're going to talk about the kind of white backlash, anti-woke, anti-DEI, anti-PC history there that I'm really interested to get into with you. But first, who wants to go first? What year are you thinking of? Any nominees?
I can kick us off. The year that I've been thinking about is 1947. That is the year that kicked off the lavender scare in the federal government, which is when the federal government began to purge employees who were gay or suspected of being gay. And the idea at the time was that if you were gay, that you were a security risk. You were a security risk, A, because you could be blackmailed, and B, because there was something corrupted about your character that made you, in the language of the time, abnormal. I think we're basically back in the lavender scare, but we got there so fast. It's actually been kind of challenging to wrap my mind around, even though we knew it was coming. But seeing people obviously fired from the military for their sexuality. Now there's a purge that's happening at the NSA. That idea that your sexual identity could be the thing that got you fired, coming just like, what are we, like 2 years, 3 years after Bostock, which was the Supreme Court ruling that said this was a protected category. And you add to that the kind of almost blood libel talk where like every time there's a plane crash or a school shooting, there are these rumors that spread around Elon Musk's internet that talk about how, well, the shooter or the pilot or whoever caused this bad thing to happen had to have been trans. And there is something just so obviously evil about that. But also, I think for me as a historian, seeing this play out, when I don't think that I truly believed that we could do this all again in all the same beats at the same level. I thought it would be sneakier, frankly. But now it's just like, oh, you're trans? You're out. So I've been thinking about that a lot just because it's helping me to think about the possibilities of the current moment in negative ways, but also because, again, like we teach things about the past and they're contained because we know that they happened and we know that they ended. And there's a sense that like that was before and this is now. And when the before becomes the now, it gives you a better appreciation for that history.
Yeah, man, that's a really good point, Niki. I've been thinking about the state of the world. I've been thinking about a lot of things and getting low-key depressed about it. And this morning, my daughter Josephine was singing Lift Every Voice and Sing. And so I'm going to start with the year 1900 because this is when James Weldon Johnson and his brother write what is considered the Black national anthem. And it was a song that really spread throughout the Black community, but also was a song that had become political, that in certain southern states it was banned from being sung in schools or being shared. And it's a song that's also sung every time there is a moment of celebration, but also every time there is a moment of retrenchment and loss. Like people lean on Lift Every Voice and Sing like it's a prayer. And I started looking at the lyrics of the song and just realizing, in the second stanza where it says, "Yet with a steady beat, have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers sighed. And then we have come over the way that with tears have been watered." Like we've been in these places before of sorrow and grief and desperation and depression. And it talks about how we've come through the path of the blood of the slaughtered, out from the gloom of the past, till now we stand at last. And it just is such a clarion call to remind people that we have been here before. Things have been absolutely difficult and hard, and yet we have endured, and yet we have persisted, and yet we have managed to resist and fight back and refuse. Yeah. And so I'm trying to focus on those things because it feels like swallowing the ocean, like I just, it's the end of Black History Month and I'm watching Trump and President Zelenskyy and Vance. I'm feeling so enraged and also so embarrassed, and so like all of these emotions and so as an internal optimist, I am always going to try to go back to not a silver lining, like it could be worse. I don't think that that's helpful, but thinking about ways in which, what have people done in the past before? How did they navigate this? What did they say? What did they do? What did they sing? And can I meditate on that for a little bit before I go back out into the trenches?
Well, that's great. And I think ties into what Niki was pointing out too, which is like, people are still going to live their lives. People are going to still find dignity in their own lives, and they're going to put one foot in front of the other, and obviously there's going to be harm and people's lives are going to be ruined as a result of decisions. But I think at some basic level, there's like, you have to remind yourself that, yeah, we're going to put one foot in front of the other. And that's the only way
keep
out.
Fighting.
And through and keep fighting. I should get bonus points here for my year being in the 18th century, 1793. and this is going to be very tenuous. We should do a proper episode on this when I'm a little more read in. But, you know, you mentioned the Zelenskyy stuff that went down on Friday, you know, pretty stunning to watch Trump and JD Vance just kind of ambush Zelenskyy in front of cameras like that. I have a thought about what it means in terms of foreign policy, but my initial take is really like another reminder that Trump thinks he's still the host of The Apprentice. And basically what he's kind of set up was like a final boardroom scene at The Apprentice where he's berating someone in front of TV cameras. And I think he like, it's funny, Zelensky's an actor. And so he kind of knew the game, you know, and he's like, okay, well, I'm going to push back. You know, I don't think Trump got what he wanted out of it from a pure theater standpoint, though it did obviously get a lot of attention. My operating premise is still that that's for Trump himself. The most important thing is just kind of what are the optics? What's the sort of
how can I be a strong man?
And and how can I get media attention? You know, and ratings. Like I think he even told Zelenskyy afterwards, like, "Well, we're going to get great ratings for this little exchange." And it's like, Jesus. There was a moment in there where he said to Zelenskyy, he said, "You know, you don't hold any of the cards," and Zelenskyy goes, "I'm not playing cards," which was just like ringing in my head. Like, what are we doing here, dude? You know. Anyway, 1793, there was this thing called the Citizen Gannett Affair, which I'll say a couple historians on Blue Sky, you know, have brought this up. I did not conjure this out of the recesses of my historical knowledge. But apparently there was this guy, Edmond Charles Gannett, who was a French diplomat. He was the French ambassador to the United States. And he shows up in 1793 and basically just ruffles a ton of feathers. And so it was another moment of like real kind of like upending of the way traditional diplomacy was run. And he went to Charleston, South Carolina, and negotiated first instead of going to the White House and negotiating in Washington, D.C. And he arranged for a bunch of ships to kind of like, you know, get moving. And I don't know. But it basically like pissed government off, you know, pissed the U.S. off and really ruffled feathers. And the optics of him going rogue when it came to diplomacy really turned against him. And so I think there's a little bit of that element here of like, I think Americans do still expect diplomacy to play out in a certain kind of way. And I will be very curious to see what the aftermath is. And I've said it on the show before, like, I do think that there's something to be said for like displaying decency and dignity. And I don't think Trump and Vance showed that. And I do think that that means something to me. That said, I would also argue, of course, that like Friday wasn't just about optics. It was really Trump and Vance showing in real time very clearly that they are on Russia's side when it comes to
Yes, no question.
And so as I'm thinking about the optics and I'm thinking about all the headlines and so forth that sort of are pointing out like, oh, they got into this screening match. That's crazy. We've never seen that. The real headline is this administration has made it very clear where they stand.
Right. That they're laying the groundwork for the U.S. leaving NATO. I mean, it's a reordering of the international order on a level that we haven't seen in decades. I mean, and if you think about the way that the U.S. has positioned itself on the world stage in incomplete and often hypocritical ways as on the side of the free world and democracy, you know, it's back in the 1940s and 1950s when the president starts to be called the leader of the free world. You can't say that anymore because that's what side the U.S. is on. And that is a reordering that you actually can't just reverse.
No, what is being done now will take a really long time to walk back. Even with the new progressive administration, that's not going to be overnight. And I don't think people appreciate just how deep the alliances have been between the United States and Europe since World War II. I mean, like these relationships have been so strong that we have actually avoided a lot of wars that would have taken place under other circumstances. And also the trade relationships and the economic relationships. I don't think people realize sort of like the ramifications of tariff wars between allies, between not just Europe, but also Canada. Like these have deep ramifications for ordinary people. And so I'm not quite sure what to make of how this is all going to play out. But I did pay attention to what Zelenskyy said as well when he was talking about, you have this big ocean and you think nobody's crossed it yet. But crossing that ocean is not necessarily like some submarine. Crossing that ocean is also this economic fallout that will happen when you don't have these relationships.
Yeah.
And cyber attacks,
yes,
which the U.S. is now quite open to.
Yeah. Absolutely.
We should do in one of these episodes, one of these Sunday episodes, a sort of deeper look at the kind of U.S.'s, role in the world and how it talks about its role in the world and the kind of America first versus, we are the leader of the free world kind of thing. I mean, the one thought I will add just in the wake of the showdown with Zelenskyy and the kind of U.S. taking a side in this war, it seems. I think some people are seeing it as like, oh, this is the sort of Trumpian retrenchment from the world and like we're just going to focus on the U.S. I didn't see that at all. There was like a real imperial undertone to that yesterday. And it's not, oh, we don't care about the rest of the world anymore. It's more, we want to get our way. That's like a 1920s sort of vibe.
Yeah.
But
more even 19th century, right? Because it's like reordering the international order around power and the idea that powerful countries should be in charge and shouldn't be restrained. So the U.S. is going to align itself with China and Russia and not with other countries.
Yeah. So we'll definitely do a dive into that. And I know listeners have reached out and wanted us to do some deeper looks into kind of like USAID specifically. And a bunch of other themes and issues. But today we're going to focus in a little bit on this question of DEI, the white backlash to DEI, the white backlash that seems to be generation after generation to ideas like PC and affirmative action. And I think the bigger question sort of over the course of this tour through history that we're going to do here is kind of, are we just seeing a sort of same cycle, generational cycle that just sort of plays out every time? And it's sometimes you call it DEI, sometimes you call it PC, sometimes you call it affirmative action, sometimes you call it civil rights, but it's just kind of part of the same pattern here.
Same lexicon.
I want to mostly do this in the 20th century and the 21st century, but like we've obviously talked about the backlash to Reconstruction in the 1870s. Very quickly, we have black codes and Jim Crow. We have restricting of voting rights in the wake of Reconstruction. Rutherford B. Hayes, we've done episodes on him, but he kind of takes federal troops out of the South, does the Compromise of 1877 that basically ends Reconstruction. And I guess my question is that the first kind of in this cycle that we're tracing of white backlash to black progress?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I see it as that exactly. I mean, when you think about Reconstruction, the crazy thing about it is that it wasn't this moment of like black power, like there were black elected officials, there were people that were in key positions, there were advancements that were made, but it was meant to rectify a deep, long harm that had taken place that was still insufficient to really repair the ramifications of slavery. And even those small advancements, people couldn't handle them. I tell my students all the time, like Black people had influence, but they didn't have power. Like they could sort of start to shape some of the world around them, but they didn't control the world around them. And I think those ideas are really important because people were responding as though Black people were in control and as though Black people had, dominated. And nothing could be further from the truth.
I mean, that's a huge theme that we'll trace is the sort of asymmetrical assessment of how much power Black people have at any given moment.
Yes,
that leads to this kind of, overreach in the backlash.
Right. And, the word that gets used for the period after Reconstruction is redemption. But we might also think of it as a kind of retrenchment or an attempt to kind of recreate the order of things as they were before this moment of progress. So the pushback is also, about trying to fit in those underlying ideas of what the racial hierarchy should be, what the economic order should be. At that point that you can't quite recreate it exactly as it was under slavery because of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So now you have to figure out, okay, so how are we going to construct a world that looks like our old world, but that is sort of slightly changed by the new rules of the game?
Interesting. All right. So if the sort of Reconstruction introduces this idea of white backlash, let's jump all the way to the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. And we've talked about them a bunch, but we have the introduction, I think, of some big ideas like states' rights, law and order. Nixon talks about the silent majority in the late 60s. And all of this kind of is under this idea of the Southern strategy, which kind of reorders politics in the United States. But to me, I don't know, do you have thoughts on that particular phrase of the silent majority? Because that feels so still relevant to the conversations playing out now. This idea that, no, we're actually speaking for the unspoken way real Americans, quote unquote, feel.
I think in part it gets at the point that you were making earlier, Jody, which is the sort of imagining an outsized other that has suddenly seized power. And the reason that I think of that is the silent majority. I will tell you, the people who voted for Richard Nixon were not silent. And they certainly were not silenced. But that idea that's embedded in this idea of the silent majority is a kind of oppression of this majority, but also that like this majority was doing things right. They were playing by the rules. They were just, they were supporting their country. And when all of these loud, angry minorities were taking to the streets, whether it was about the civil rights or whether it was about the Vietnam War, these good, humble Americans were still there, were still believing in their country. And they made up the silent majority of Americans who were going unheard. But I think that just the framing of it as the silent majority is doing a lot of work.
Oh, yeah. It's a misnomer. But it also goes into the idea that the silent majority are somehow victims, that they are somehow owed or that they are somehow entitled to certain ideas that have been denied them or that have been taken away from them. And so when you posit it in a way where it makes people seem as though they should be defensive, as though they should be sort of standing this ground, it shapes the entire narrative, really, about like who's in power, who's not in power, who's pulling the strings, who's not pulling the strings. And that, I think, illegitimate victimization is something that has played in really well with the right. It's something that people can always sort of champion because there's this sweetheartness for the underdog. There's this idea that if you've been wrong, there's, some comeuppance waiting for you. Like people, I think, really are seduced by that idea.
But it also just kind of, I think, widens the spectrum on which people can kind of think of themselves as part of this coalition. When you say, like, no, you don't have to be a member of the sort of rabid right. You can be part of the silent majority, And I think a lot of people sort of feel that way, right?
Well, it's the same value of that language, like states' rights and law and order, is that it's not segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, right? It gives you an easier way in because you don't have to like use racial slurs. You can just like slide right in talking about states' rights. And I think that's that attention to language is interesting.
So it's definitely like, obviously there's policy goals behind it and power goals behind it. But it is also really, I think, deft framing, and it taps into a sort of cultural feeling as well, which as we continue to move this conversation to now, I think just like the cultural element is really fascinating to me. I will say when it comes to this moment that we're talking about here, I think I mentioned this on the show, but right after the election last fall, I reread parts of The Selling of the President in 1968, which is that Joe McGinnis book about Nixon's run. And my God, it's just like, that is the blueprint. It is incredible how much the Trump campaign, the Trump sort of ethos just feels ripped right from that campaign, including this kind of language about the silent majority. Worth revisiting that, maybe even an episode on that book specifically. Okay, let's move it into the sort of more recent history, and frankly, a history in which some of the kind of actual characters are still kicking around, right? Let's call it the affirmative action wars of the 70s and 80s. I mean, it feels like the territory really, this conversation. And 90s. But we're gonna reframe it as the PC wars as we get into the 90s. But, in the 70s and 80s, it felt like that was the watchword, right? Affirmative action.
Yeah.
What does the rise of affirmative action as the kind of territory on which this stuff is being contested, and what does the backlash to affirmative action look like?
I mean, the rise of affirmative action is about trying to bring in, especially in higher education and in corporate sectors as well, more diversity. I mean, colleges and universities all across the country were predominantly white. I mean, the numbers of Black students and Latino students and Native American students, we're talking like single digits, you know what I mean? Double digits when you have tens of thousands of students. It's not a lot. And so there's a moment to try to rectify that, to try to increase those numbers. But I think the backlash comes in when a lot of the intention behind that is not well explained, when it is not... when it is posited as though it's going to be quotas, as though it's taking seats away from white students, as also the narrative it's shaped that the Black students or students of color that occupy those spaces, that they're never qualified, that they never meet the snuff, that they're just coming in surely on the basis of their skin color and nothing else. And I also think, did I mention quotas? The idea of quotas as well is the idea that we're only going to take, or we have to take 10%, or we have to take X amount of percent to get balance. And the balance is never justified. It's just a numbers game. It's never about like anything else. And then maybe it's in the 1990s, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Niki, too, about like where it becomes this idea of like, it's reverse discrimination or reverse racism or whatever. But that is sort of the backlash that you get. So that every time a person of color is in power, it's, oh, well, affirmative action.
Yeah.
Right. And it's an idea that's sort of based in this false notion that in the world before, where Black people and women were excluded from universities and the workforce and all of these different places, that was a pure meritocracy. And that
Yes.
pure meritocracy is violated by the changing composition of all of those spaces. And you do get that idea that then in order to include more people, that you must discriminate against white men. And that idea of reverse discrimination starts to become popularized in 1988 by Robert Bork. Robert Bork is a good person to talk about because, his Supreme Court nomination gets scotched in the 1980s. But it is the Supreme Court who comes in and starts, trying to reinterpret affirmative action in the late 1970s, a now overruled case, the University of California versus Bakke, is the one in which they were like, well, you can't have quotas, but you can consider race as you are thinking about admissions. And it turns out, as we know, the Supreme Court has recently said, well, even that is too much. Any hint that you might be thinking about race at all at any point in college admissions is evidence of discrimination. And that's kind of where we are now. But the affirmative action pushback was starting almost as soon as the idea of affirmative action was introduced in the 60s and early 70s.
Mm-hmm.
But Kellie, your point about this kind of introducing this idea of like reverse discrimination, I think, is a big part of the 70s and 80s. But then also this idea that like any person of color in a position of power must have gotten there through illegitimate means. And that was the sort of table stakes under which Donald Trump and Elon Musk were operating kind of in the wake of, say, that plane crash, where they came out and said, this was a result of DEI. What that effectively is that any person of color who was in a position of power, by definition, was illegitimate.
Or General, I'm thinking about the firing of General Charles Q. Brown, where this obviously every administration people change out their people. That's not necessarily new, but it was the justification of, oh, he's a DEI hire. It's like, wait a second, you hired him in your administration, and the idea that it had nothing to do with qualifications, it had nothing to do with decisions or policy that he had made. It had everything to do with simply the fact that he was Black. And the crazy thing is they bring in a white guy to replace him who's less qualified.
Significantly less qualified. In fact, doesn't meet the qualifications of the role.
Well, he has one qualification that is very important for them.
Whiteness is all that matters. That's all. He's a white man. That's all that matters. And I could not think of something that was more blatant, like, just call a spade a spade. Like, why not just say, we're letting you go because you're Black? And it's like, and that's literally kind of what DEI is the dog whistle for saying those things. It's the same thing. I think they call it, like, Governor Westmore, like a DEI governor.
Yeah.
It's like,
right.
But
And
we
so-
know what that means when they say
Right.
that.
Yeah, it's
Right.
like, just say the word.
And
I know.
Yeah, and I want to, that's kind of, we'll get to that in a second about kind of how that phrase DEI or that idea DEI has just like shifted in a really important way to go from these sort of inclusion programs to just basically a proxy for, the N word, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if we're in the 70s and 80s, so just to sort of, put a pin in it, like I do think this key idea of introducing reverse discrimination is a really kind of key through line. But then also something you said, Kellie, about how I felt like a lot of the sort of the white backlash wars of the 70s and 80s have moved to universities and corporations. And clearly we see that being a lot of the place that this is being played out on, or has been played out on over the last couple of generations. And I think as we move into the 90s and we kind of talk about how the terminology maybe shifted to the idea of PC and political correctness.
Yes.
I think a lot of that started with anxiety over what was happening in universities, right?
Yes.
Universities are getting way too PC, and there's these speech codes, and people are bending. And I went to Wesleyan University, which was the university that was the model of PCU, which is this movie, that kind of mocked the sort of like overly politically correct liberal institutions. But that feels like one of the big kind of shifts moving into this.
Oh, yeah. The 90s, I feel like the 90s was the decade of multiculturalism, where you had all of these scholars and academics talking not just about Black issues, but Latino issues, Native issues, Asian issues, like cover it all. We want everyone to be represented. And that kind of rainbow coalition, the idea of doing all of that freaked people out. And the idea of, we're not going to say Black, we're going to say African American. We're not going to say Hispanic, we're going to say Latino. We're going to have different terms for how we identify groups of people that will feel more politically correct. We're going to be much more multicultural. It's not Oriental, it's Asian. Like there are all these different language cues that also come out that get paired with these ideas that has a backlash too. Like, so much a part of this backlash is actually not just policy. It's the language around that policy that freaks people out.
Yeah.
And the language is a really interesting entering wedge. One, because it can be tied to universities. It's seen as an elite phenomenon, even though what it actually is that you've now included a bigger group of people. And when they come in, they're like, actually, please don't call me Oriental.
Yes,
And so they're giving you new language, or for like women starting to be included in these spaces, right? Like say firefighter instead of fireman, so that it feels like everyone's included when you talk about these things. But it gets framed as an elite phenomenon, and it gets framed as insignificant, that it's not about discrimination.
Trivial.
It's not about segregation. It's not about misogyny or patriarchy. It is about these fights over language and how they want to control you and control your language. But it is a proxy for all of those things, right? It is a proxy for an anxiety over too many people of color, too many women being in these spaces, that something fundamentally has been lost. And the language level is a much easier one to fight on than calling for purging Black people from universities.
Yeah, but that idea, I'm so glad you mentioned that, and I'm just sort of realizing, like, that kind of pushback against language that we see rise in this era continues now. Now it's called the kind of anti-virtue signaling, right? Calling, sort of, and I'm like, people should signal their virtues. That's, in my opinion, that's great, right? But that is the same phenomenon, right? The anti-PC thing and the anti-virtue signaling thing. There's all these serious issues underlying it, but it's played out in this kind of like, oh yeah, I see all these white people bending over backwards to seem woke or to seem whatever. And so I think we get that introduced here. That's what that movie PCU was kind of lampooning. And I think we see that sort of swirl of the sort of cultural and the academic and the political happening here.
Niki, when does Politically Incorrect come out? The show, is that also the 90s?
The show launches in 1993. And it is about this idea, right? There are topics that you can't talk about. There are things you can't say. And we are going to do that on this show. And notably, it was on Comedy Central, right? It was led by Bill Maher, a comedian, always had comedians as part of the roundtable. And that intersection, I mean, we see that still today, where comedians
Bill Maher himself still.
Yes. Bill Maher still himself. Joe Rogan is a stand-up comedian. Like that there is a sense that because comedy is transgressive, that it is a victim of these PC wars. But I wanted to go back to what you said, Jody, about virtue signaling, because there is a direct tie to political correctness in that, because both political correctness and virtue signaling suggest that the people are changing language not because it signals an underlying value, but because they're trying to fit in or be holier than thou. And that, I think, is really important, because it is basically a statement that there is nothing authentic about an embrace of diversity, that under it all, everyone really knows that these hierarchies are good and should be sustained, but it's no longer okay to say that. And so some people see the world clearly and some people don't.
Yeah.
And that's where it also kind of then also ropes in sort of this cultural dimension too, right? So it's not just about which policies do you support, but it's about the media you consume and the way comedians talk and the way that the celebrities talk and the way that, the press writes headlines and all that. But just that kind of like cultural uneasiness, I think is a big part of this. And I haven't looked into this, I think we could, but like, I wonder if there was anxiety, as you were saying, Kellie, like the 90s was a moment of like multiculturalism. I don't think there was like true representation, but like in the 90s we get the Cosby Show is big, in the 80s and the 90s we get In Living Color, we get and I'm sure there's an anxiety about just that,
Black TV was on. That was a highlight.
So in the 90s Black TV was huge.
Family Matters. I mean, I as a kid had a smorgasbord of TV shows to watch, cartoons and TV and even film, you might say, to choose from, that also was diverse too. It wasn't, every family wasn't the Cosby Show, like different stories that were being told, but we have not gotten back to that moment.
Other than I really think it's impossible to look at what's happening now without looking at the fact that there was, just for a few years, in the wake of Me Too and in the wake of George Floyd, there was an effort to kind of diversify Hollywood and culture and so forth. And I think a lot of the anxiety that we see now rose from the fact that they looked around and they said, oh gosh, like Black Panther and, all these woke movies and stuff being made.
Yeah. So and the Me Too movement too. Oh, I can't talk to her. Can't say anything to her. Yeah.
And they put women in Ghostbusters. Yeah. But I do think that's, I would want to bring it back to what Kellie was saying about the golden age of Black television in the 1990s. It was also the case with like country music at the time. Women were getting 1 to 2 radio play versus men. So that is, for every 2 songs sung by a man, 1 song was sung by a woman. It's now 1 to 10.
What?
You have to sit through 10 songs sung by men and 1 where you hear 1 by a woman. And it's
that's
bro
crazy.
country is now what the country dial looks like. But the reason that I want to emphasize that is that, yes, it is triggering all these anxieties when you have women in Ghostbusters, or Taylor Swift shows up at a football game, or you have Black Panther come out. But you're already talking about a world that has gotten smaller in its representation, but it's still triggering a outsized reaction.
So there's that cultural dimension. I'll point out this political dimension and rhetoric. Pat Buchanan, who we've talked about a lot on this show, who Niki obviously wrote a whole book about and knows very well. But, there's this introduction of the idea of traditional American values in the 90s. And obviously that's like, I think, very clearly tied to this silent majority idea, right? Like, who is the real Americans? What are the traditional values? It's all those people who we're the voice of. And then I want to come back, because I think it does bridge us to now. But the anxiety over what's happening in universities, I'm really fascinated by. And I think in the 90s, we've talked about it a little bit, but, you get people who are still kicking around now, but like Dinesh D'Souza writes this book, A Liberal Education, in 1991, that sort of plants this idea that these universities are these breeding grounds of lefties and sort of overly PC. Maybe this is a naive question, but why do people freak out so much about what's happening in universities?
I know why. But go ahead, Niki. Go ahead.
I'm actually really curious what your answer is.
I mean, I think that some of this is true, some of this not. But for the most part, colleges and universities create the next generation's leaders. They create the next bosses. They create the next, not just leaders for the country, but possibly global leaders, especially if you're talking about Ivy League education. And because college for a good amount of people is upward economic mobility, it is your track to get to where you want to be in a capitalist society. That is one of the most coveted spaces. It is about power. It is about access. It is about money. And learning is actually secondary or tertiary. You know what I mean? It's about sports. Like, I mean,
yeah, but it's less about what you're being learned and more about the space that creates these networks of power.
But also the values that are in there. And like when I think about this arc, I go all the way back to 1951 when William F. Buckley Jr., conservative writer, publishes his first book, God and Man at Yale. And basically he's arguing that those liberal professors are indoctrinating students with socialism and Keynesianism and are therefore warping, as Kellie was saying, the next generation of leaders in the United States. And you see this again and again. There's a book by Jean Laboultier called Harvard Hates America that comes out in 1980. Illiberal Education does this. The Closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom in 1987. There is sort of a cottage industry to attack these universities because they're understood as repositories of power. They give something real, materially real, economically real to their students. That we can talk about whether that's still true today. And therefore, they're institutions that conservatives want to control. And they are also institutions that can be painted as elite.
Yeah.
And absolutely. They are also the places where white students are joining the civil rights movement in the 1960s, where they're joining the anti-war movement in the 1960s. And I think that's a big pivot point, too. And the anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s.
Yeah. So, first off, I'm watching the clock here, and I want to let us get back to our Sundays and let the listeners get back to their Sundays. So I think we should do more on the kind of campus wars, I think, of the 90s. Really fascinating. But I am struck by the fact that I think that the argument on and the anxiety in the 90s is legit. That like for a century, this has been the place where you kind of make your networks, where you get your power, where you kind of connect with people who are then going to help you in your career and enter into politics and all that stuff. And gosh, that's being taken away from us, quote unquote. And so there's anxiety over that. The irony about where we are now is that universities, I think, don't play that role as much anymore. And moreover, like the whole Silicon Valley ethos is like universities don't matter anymore. Forget the universities. And so I'm just fascinated by the very complicated way in which they're very easy to denounce and boogeyman. But at the same time, I think there is this sort of changed landscape of like, it isn't the only place where people really make those connections of power the way that they did in previous generations.
And in part, we don't do that because the political economy of the university and the country as a whole has changed. So now you're just as likely to leave the university with $100,000 in student loans and no real career opportunities. And there aren't places where it's just like easy money, solid career, those kinds of things.
Tons
that
of connections,
And I think that's why we've seen a rise in sports gambling, the influencer culture. Because when you were talking about influence, I was like, well, maybe it's social media.
Oh, yeah.
Because that's where people try to figure it out, right?
Spot on.
Yeah.
I
want to do a proper episode on the kind of specific, tracing the specific metastasization of the word woke. I think it's really fascinating. But obviously, this brings us to this anti-woke backlash, both the perversion of what that word means and then the backlash to it, I think is obviously a big factor now. And then this anti-DEI thing. And so let's wrap up here with where we kind of started in this conversation, which is the way in which, just I'd say in the last year, DEI and the conversation about DEI among conservatives has shifted from a backlash to what it really was intended to be, which is diversity, equity, inclusion efforts, to it becoming a proxy word for basically just people of color. Thoughts on how we got to this moment and whether it connects back to what we've been discussing?
We've seen those kinds of linguistic changes before. Newt Gingrich called Barack Obama the food stamp president, and he wasn't talking about the increase in the number of food stamps. DEI has replaced affirmative action as a stand-in for a descriptor that means Black person who we don't think, who's living off of the government or who we think has something that they haven't earned. I mean, the metastasization that I'm sort of interested in addition to that is, here, maybe we thought we were fighting over a language or over programs at colleges, but what we were actually fighting over was the resegregation of the government and of public life. And so it is interesting to see those word wars very explicitly tie back into, I think, probably one of the largest purges of Black people from public life that we've seen since the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah. And that is what I think is also so devastating, because Black people have constantly been in search of safe spaces, of places and spaces that will create belonging and inclusion. And believe it or not, the federal government was that space where, in the Black communities, get you a good government job. You just want a good government job because it was stable, it was protective, it allowed you to actually get to a Black middle class. It allowed you to generate wealth in some ways, to put your kids in college. If you had even GI benefits or VA benefits, there are all these avenues that you could access as a Black person through the federal government, especially when your state was not doing that. And so when those jobs get purged or lost, I really think that in the next, 2-3 generations, that there's going to be a loss of wealth in Black and brown communities and communities that really benefited from the federal government. And yeah, it's a serious deal. It's not just or a few people are out of jobs. It's about protected spaces.
It is really fascinating how that word DEI and the kind of anti-DEI efforts are doing so much work in so many different lanes. I mean, you're right. It's useful for conservatives to push back against the sort of cultural dimension, right? And say, oh gosh, the woke days are over, the DEI days are over. It's useful, as we've been discussing, to delegitimize individuals and say you didn't get here for a reason. You're a DEI hire. But then I think, as both of you just described, it's really important to point out, like Donald Trump signed an executive order in which he talked about we're ending wasteful DEI governmental programs. And that merging of like the idea that something is DEI and it's by definition wasteful then allows you to kind of do, as you were discussing, the sort of the purging and dismantling of government that we're seeing happen right now. But it's just kind of important to point out how that same word, that same rhetoric can be used in all these different lanes.
Yeah, and that it conceals something, because we were talking before the show about 1913 and Woodrow Wilson segregating the federal government. When Woodrow Wilson segregated the federal government, he was like, Black people can't work here anymore. Like it was just open. And now it's, well, we're getting rid of these DEI jobs, these jobs that people didn't earn. And when you push back and you're like, you have no right to fire those people for a lot of different reasons. What you hear in response is, well, if those people held those jobs and were good at them, then they wouldn't have been fired. So it is a sort of shift back to that meritocratic language that disguises what is just what Woodrow Wilson was doing, which was segregating the government.
Yeah.
So I'll end with the kind of question we've been nibbling around. Is it just going to be the case that like every generation and a half, there's going to be this cycle of like 1 step forward, 2 steps back? Will that kind of white backlash, whether you call it anti-affirmative action, anti-PC, anti-DEI, anti-woke, will it just keep coming back?
Yes. And you know why? Yes, because people are never going to stop fighting. People are never going to stop pushing for progress, for justice, for inclusion, for equity. Like that is never going to stop. So as long as you have people who are committed to doing that work, the language will change, the name will change, the people in power will change. But because those ideas are still there will always be this cyclical dynamic, which I don't know, you could say that's encouraging or not, but I think that you will always you will always have pushback to progress.
And it's a reminder that the fight is never won, right? People are not
Yes.
going to give up power willingly. And that is one of the stories of U.S. history, is even when you see progress, you see that pushback because inclusion feels like loss to some people. And so, even when we get out of this particular hole and push forward, there are always going to be people who are pushing back against that system and who are fighting to keep privileges and hierarchies that harm other people. And part of the reason for that is the understanding of freedom in the United States has long included not just personal freedom, but the freedom to oppress other people. And as long as that's sort of part of the conception of what liberty and freedom are, we're going to have to keep finding ways to push back against it.
Yeah.
All right. We're going to end and we'll get back to our Sundays. But no, this is great. I mean, I really love getting together, and I think listeners, we're going to keep doing this on Sundays, and I hope you continue to give us ideas about sort of different slices of the conversation that we can pull off and try and trace some historical threads from. What else? Go to the newsletter. I would say in the newsletter, to circle back to some of the stuff I said at the beginning, I'm going to talk about the name change in the newsletter. We're going to continue to ask for your ideas about stuff to talk about on these Sunday conversations. I will talk about my new music podcast in the newsletter as well, and a little bit about our plans for 2026. So sign up for the newsletter. Thank you to everyone who's been watching on YouTube. And of course, thank you to everyone who's been listening. And Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
All right.